What are the key characteristics of feudalism? Well, to ask that, we first have to ask why feudalism developed. Feudalism developed because of the collapse of the Roman Empire. The collapse meant a decentralization of government because the emperor no longer had the power to keep people safe. To protect themselves, the public turned to lords who could protect them with their vast resources. Feudalism flourished from the 9th to 15th century and is considered an important step towards modern nation-states. These lords created small, isolated manors with small local governments. An example of a local government is a state police officer chasing a car. They can pull over the car to give them a ticket as long as they are within jurisdiction, but the second the car crosses state lines, the cop can no longer pursue them. This isolation led to the economic system typical of feudalism known as manorialism. A lord owned large amounts of land which he let others work in return for labor or money. This offered structure to rural life. The barons, nobles, and lords oversaw the monetary aspects of the manor. Dispute about land and judicial issues was part of the manor's functions. The church was involved in every aspect of life, whether petty in nature or if it involved more important issues. Chivalry arose among the knights as an unofficial code concerning training, bravery, battle, and serving others. They swore allegiance to their lords. To dishonor the code or go against the oath given was shameful. This helped offer some social order. The feudal hierarchy was broken up into four main parts: monarchs, nobility, knights and vassals, and peasants, with the church reigning above all of them. The monarchs were oftentimes symbolic leaders, although they did technically have control over any and all assets and decided how much land to grant the lords. Next was the nobility. They performed a number of tasks to help the king, whether that be acting as an advisory, farming, or anything else. Their main roles were to protect the king and the people and rent out land or fiefs to their vassals. They were expected to serve in royal council, gather knights for war, give food to the king, and pay taxes if needed. After the nobility came knights and vassals. Knights and vassals generally had the same duties, though the main difference was the power of the lord they served. They were expected to follow a chivalrous lifestyle and be loyal to their lord in return for fiefs. If the vassals acted inappropriately, their land and title were taken away immediately. Lastly were the peasants. They made up the majority of the population during the Middle Ages. Although they were technically the lowest on the pyramid, they played a vital role in society. They worked on the land so the higher classes could spend their time preparing for their duties. There were two types of peasants, the free and the unfree, who were also known as serfs. Free peasants were rented land to farm and only owed the lord rent in return for the plot of land. Serfs, on the other hand, had to farm on the lord's land and were forbidden to leave. Both types of peasants were subject to taxes. Head money was a yearly payment that the peasants were expected to pay, along with tallage, a tax from the peasant's lord. Right under the knights and vassals were the clergy, or the religious people. They had a profound impact on feudal society and were arguably more powerful than the king himself. The Roman Catholic Church acted as a unifier as it affected everyone, regardless of their social class. They imposed a tax that people believed would show them the way of everlasting life and happiness. They also ran religious festivals every month to help unify the people. Much like the feudal social classes, there was a strict hierarchy within the church. The bishops were the leaders of the church and were comparable to nobles in terms of the power they had. Next were the priests. They weren't wealthy like the bishops, but they were the symbolic head of the church. They were the ones who administered sacraments and sat for confessions. Then there were monks who acted as perfect Christians. They were often scholars and transcribed parts of the Bible. Lastly, the nuns. They weren't as educated as the monks, but they served the people, providing convents for young women and widows. This social stratification led to a relationship developing between the lord and the serf. It was based on loyalty and servitude, where the serfs worked the land belonging to the lord, doing activities such as farming or animal handling. Lords could have as many serfs as they could provide for. These serfs offered them food and other labor. Peasants and serfs mostly contributed in working on manor farms. They worked different types of field work, cared for livestock, sustained buildings, and did maintenance on structures, and many other things. The term serf derived from the word service, or another term for servants. Since they are bonded to the manor land, they are not allowed to leave without any permission. Serfs are allowed to cultivate some certain tracts of land themselves while working for their lord, which makes them different from other slaves. Serfs provided percentages in everything they do for their lord. Here are some primary sources concerning the social structure during feudal times. This first one, the Statement on Mutual Feudal Obligations between Lord and Vassal from 1020, shows how vassals were loyal to their lords and swore fidelity to them. Vassals had to do what is safe, honorable, useful, easy, practicable, and harmless. They had to base decisions around the lord's safety and well-being. Next, Emperor Louis the Pious wrote on tithes. If the people were not loyal to the Frankish church and didn't pay, they risked losing their benefice, or their land. They could pay with money, goods and livestock, and labor. You also have the grant of minting coins to Abbey of Corvey, and that documents the local minting of money under manorialism, again with the sort of closed systems. And then you have from Edward the Elder coinage regulations and William of Malmesbury counterfeit money in the time of King Stephen, and those document the problems they had, such as counterfeiting. European feudalism was a kind of socio-political organization that involved the people like the monarch, peasants, nobility, knights, and vassals. They're portrayed in these graphics doing stuff like working on a manor farm, doing field work, caring for livestock, and maintaining buildings. Vassals are known for their sincerity and loyalty to their lords who provided protection and a stable land. Typically, the manor and towns surrounding them were defensive and isolated, located near rivers, and included castles, a parish, a village, and farmland. They used 3-field rotation for farming. Each area of land, or fief, was separated into a small community around the lord who owned that land. These places were called manors and consisted of a castle, parish, village, and surrounding farmland. The manors were isolated and small to increase safety and defense. The lord's castle was stocked with arms and weapons to defend the manor in case of attack. Most lords who owned land had manors surrounding their castles, so many of these communities popped up in Europe. While the lord lived in a big castle, the serfs and other peasants lived in a small, one-room mud house. They spent a lot of their time working or going to the local parish. Since their physical lives were full of hard labor, they wanted to ensure they would go to heaven and be freed of their servitude in the afterlife. The 3-field system was used to ensure the manor had enough food supply. The land was divided into farmland, meadowland, and wasteland. Each peasant was assigned a 1-acre plot of land, and the best plot was given to the lord of the manor. In the spring, each peasant would plant wheats in 1/3 of their plot. Then, they planted oats and barley in another third. The last third was left bare so the soil could be rested. This system was very beneficial for harvesting enough food, and sometimes gave a surplus. This image shows an example of how a manor would be structured. The lord's castle or manor house was the biggest structure in the manor. The village church or parish was owned by the lord and close to the castle. It was frequented by the peasants. Dirt roads were built to transport food and other goods within the manor and the surrounding fields. The peasants' homes were close to the plots of land they owned. Other areas of the manor were made for specialized work, such as blacksmithing and bread making. These manors had all the necessary tools to be self-sufficient. So, to recap, the key characteristics of feudalism are the social structure, which had the church, monarch, nobility, knights and vassals, and peasants in it. Chivalry arose because of this, because of the knights and vassals. Then there were the lord and serf relationships that developed, where the lord provided land and protection in return for labor and money. And then lastly, the town structure, where villages and farms were built around the lord's castle, and they were defensive in nature. They were typically located near water, and their isolation caused manorialism, which is the economic system that developed and added structure to the rural world.